set of Ascension that we picked up at Origins is called Delirium, and I'm going to take a few minutes to kind of show you the main differences between Delirium and some other sets. This is the board. As you see, there aren't any special zones like for temples or events, because this is mainly going to be based off a currency that is called Insight, which if you've played Dreamscape before, Insight looks like this. They're these little jewels. So the smaller ones are worth 1 and the bigger ones are worth 5. Now, what we're using that for, there's a few different things we're using it for, but one of the main things that makes this set Delirium is the Delirium dice. So I'm going to show you that right here. So the Delirium die, I should say, has 6 different sides, and I'll zoom this in so I can show you what each one does. Thankfully, on the image itself is a pretty good indicator of what it does. 1 maybe not as much, but if you roll a 1, oh my god, go into focus. Alright, if you roll a 1, you can banish a card from your hand or your discard pile. If you roll a 2, you draw 2 cards from your deck. 3, you gain 3 rune. 4, you gain 4 attack. 5, you gain 5 honor. Or 6, you gain 6 insight. So there's a few ways you can roll the Delirium die. The main one that you always have access to is with insight. So those insight that I showed earlier, if you at least have 5 insight, you can pay those 5 to be able to roll this die, in which I rolled a 1, which is the worst result possible. But there's some other ways that you can roll that die as well. First is going to be Dream Dealer. It's a 4-cost Enlightened Hero. It says draw a card, then banish a card in the center row. If there is 1 Enlightened, 1 Lifebound, Mechana, and Void card in the center row, roll the Delirium die. So as long as this condition is met, instead of paying 5 insight, you basically get to roll it for free. Another card that can also roll the Delirium die would be this monster right here. It's called Oak of Souls. It's 5 power to kill. The reward is gain 3 honor and roll the Delirium die. So you can pay 5 insight to roll this. You can defeat certain monsters, or you can fulfill certain conditions on a card you have played. So for the Delirium dice, we talked about, if you have 5 insight, you can roll it, but we didn't really discuss how you gain that insight. So there's a few different ways you can gain it. The first one is going to be cards that just directly give you insight when you play it. This is Dreamscape Diviners, a 1-cost Enlightened Hero. It will gain 2 insight when you play it. Another example of a card that can gain you insight is Pollen Pixie. Now, Pollen Pixie, to people that haven't played Dreamscape, doesn't look like it gives any insight, but whenever a card is Dreamborn and it enters the center row, both players are going to receive 1 insight, and for the player that buys this card, they're going to gain an additional insight. So you have cards that give you insight directly, and cards that give it to you indirectly by coming into the center row or buying the card itself. Something also that is new to this set, which you couldn't previously do in Dreamscape, is if a player goes first, everything is as normal, they draw 5 cards. But if a player goes second, they start off with 1 insight. So you always have 1 more than your opponent at the start of the game. So that's something that you can also kind of play in conjunction with some cards that we're going to talk about going forward. So I'm just going to set those aside. A way to use some of that insight, the first card is also going to introduce a new mechanic that we haven't seen before in Ascension. So this is called Dreamscape Dryad. It's a 2-cost Lifebound Hero. It gains 3 honor, but it has an additional effect called Recur. You can pay 3 insight to recur, so you gain the above effect 1 additional time. So you can play this card to gain 3 honor, give 3 insight that you have back to the insight pile, and gain an additional 3 honor. So 6 honor on a card that costs 2. That's nothing we've seen before. So I mean, that can get pretty insane if someone's just trying to empty the honor pool pretty quickly. Another way that you can use that insight is with this. This Dimension Monk is a 2-cost Enlightened hero. You draw a card, or you can pay 1 to recur. So for a 2-cost card, you can pay 1 insight to draw 2 cards. Normally, drawing 2 cards is kind of reserved to those Enlightens that cost 5, but that's a very inexpensive way to draw cards through your deck pretty quickly. So that's another way you can use that insight that you gain either through going second, which you're only getting 1, but still it comes more into play than you think, or seeking out cards like these that will just gain that insight for you. If you don't want to use it for the Delirium dice, which is, it's always an optional thing. Maybe you want to save for the Delirium Die instead, or maybe you have some of these effects in your deck and you rather have these recur multiple times. Another way that you can use that insight is going to be on monsters as well. So here's Bleak Toad. It's a 4 power monster to kill, gains 4 honor, and you banish your card from your hand to discard pile. And just like Recur, you can pay an additional insight amount too, in this case, to banish another additional card. So whether it's monsters or heroes you acquire, you can still use that insight to be able to basically duplicate an effect. Now in this case, you're not duplicating the whole thing, you're just duplicating the ability to banish again. So with the heroes, you're getting the listed effect twice. Rather, it's drawing an additional card, gaining an additional 3 honor with that. But for this, you're just getting the ability to banish another additional card, which is still really good. Banishing cards is always a good strategy to get those starting apprentice and malicious out the deck. Now we're going to talk about another new thing that you can use insight for, and also a bit of a throwback to some earlier days of Ascension, and those are fate effects. So this is Shield Bearer. It's a 4-cost void hero. Its effect says draw a card. You may banish a card in your hand or discard pile. But it has a fate effect that says you may auction insight to gain the effect below. Now normally for fates, as they work, is when it enters the center row, the fate triggers. Normally fates would have a symmetrical effect for both players, or for multiple players if it's like a 4-player game. But in this instance, I'm going to just assume there's 2 people playing because it's going to make this explanation a little easier. So Shield Bearer enters the center row. When that happens, whoever is the turn player, so whoever turn it is when they enter the center row, they have the ability to auction first. Now with auction, you at least have to start with 1 insight, and for any of your bids, you at least have to have that amount of insight in your control. So I can't auction 5 insight as a bid to try to, make sure my opponent doesn't get an effect if I only have 2 in play. So in this situation, let's assume that I have 5 insight and my opponent also has 5 insight. So this comes out in the center row. It's like, okay, so it's during my turn, so I'm going to be at 1 insight. Then it passes to my opponent. They can either have a higher bid than what I initially said, so they can, bid 2, they can bid 3, they can bid in as high as they want to, as long as they have that amount of insight. Or they can say, well, I don't value that effect very much, I'll pass. And the moment someone passes, whoever has the highest bid is going to be the person that gets that effect. So if this comes out in the center row, I bid 1. Let's say it goes to my opponent. My opponent's like, okay, I like this effect. I'm going to bid 2 insight. So it goes back to me. I can either increase that bid to 3, 4, or whatever I want to, or I can just pass. So let's say in this case, I'm going to bid 3 insight. Then it goes back to my opponent, which they can do the same thing. They can either increase the bid up to 4, 5, or they can, say, I don't value that very much. So let's say they pass at that point. I've bid 3 insight. That is now the winning bid for the auction. I send my 3 insight in my control back to the insight pile, and then that effect triggers right away. So if my opponent were to win that auction, even though it's during my turn, that effect would still trigger right away. The draw a card, banish a card from your hand or discard pile, that would trigger right away. Another example of a fate effect would be Infernal Templar. So the option is the same, but the effect says draw a card. If you control 2 or more constructs, draw an additional card. So same thing in this case. Let's make the scenario a little different. So my opponent and I each have 5 insight, and let's say this comes out during my turn. So it starts with me. So let's say I be at 2 insight, because like I said, you don't have to start at 1. You can start at any number you want to, as long as you control that much insight. So let's say I start at 2, and my opponent really wants this effect for some reason. So he says, you know what, I'm going to be at 5 insight. Now, I only have 5 insight in play. My opponent also has 5 insight. So because he named 5, it's legal for him to do so because he has 5 insight. I can no longer win that bid, because in order for me to have a higher bid, I have to at least call 6, which I don't have 6. So basically, he put himself in a situation where he guarantees that he wins that bid. So I have to pass since I can't be at 6, and that bottom effect is gonna go off. So hopefully, if an opponent was bidding 5, you're drawing 2 cards, because drawing 1 off that, unless you know what that 1 card is probably not the best idea. But that's just an example of, you can bid in any denomination you want. You don't have to at least go up by 1. Alright, so we'll move that to the side. We're going to talk about Mechana constructs. So normally Mechana constructs kind of have a similar theme in each set that they're in. And for this, each get an effect when you play it the first time. So this says it's Clockwork Shield. This is a 3-cost Mechana construct. Once per turn, when you play a Mechana construct, including this one, you gain 1 honor for each Mechana construct you control. So if I have this card and I play it, I get 1 honor because I only have 1 construct. Then we have something like Clockwork Blade, 4-cost Mechana construct, Dreamborn. So when it comes into the center row, both players gain an insight like we talked about earlier. Whoever buys it gets an additional insight. But in this case, let's say it's in my hand. So this was already out from a previous turn. When I play this, you gain 1 attack for each Mechana construct you control. So if this is already in play and I play this, both effects are going to go off. So Clockwork Shield is going to gain 1 for each Mechana construct. So there's 2 in play. I'm going to gain 2 honor. This is going to gain 1 attack for each Mechana construct in play. I'm going to gain 2 attack. So 2 honor, 2 attack. So now I'm going to revisit 2 concepts that are from a previous set called Valley of the Ancients. And those are Serenity and Echo. So Serenity is basically found in line cards. So first I'll show the Serenity. So when you acquire this card, put it in your hand. So this is a card, defeats a monster that's 4 or less. Serenity occurs when there is no discard pile. Like you don't have a discard pile. So if at the very start of the game you have 4 rune and 1 power and no discard pile, you buy this card, it's immediately going to go to your hand. So you can kill a monster turn 1. I mean, you can kill a good monster on turn 1. So Serenity, like I said, triggers when there is no discard pile. The other effect is Echo, which Echo does explain on the card itself. Echo will gain an additional effect if there's a void card in your discard pile. It doesn't have to be a hero, it can be a construct. But as long as there's 1 in the void, as long as there's 1 in the discard pile, the moment you play this card, if there's 1 there, you're going to get that additional effect. So that is an example of some of the cards that are in Delirium and how they interact with the old Delirium Die.